The Catholic Church, for all its centuries of history, has rarely faced a moment quite like this one. The division within the Church had always been present, but in recent years it had become undeniable, and at its heart were two key figures, Cardinal Raymond Burke and Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. These two men, though both loyal servants of the Church, embodied starkly contrasting visions for its future. Their ideological divide was more than just a matter of personal opinion. It symbolized the very battle between tradition and progress that had been simmering beneath the surface of the Vatican. Cardinal Burke was a figure known for his unwavering commitment to tradition. He had risen through the ranks of the Church precisely because of his staunch defense of doctrine, and as a traditionalist, he believed that the teachings of the Church should remain unchanged as a beacon of stability in a rapidly changing world. Burke's criticism of Pope Francis's more progressive reforms had earned him both admiration and resentment. His defense of orthodoxy, particularly on issues like divorce, remarriage, and homosexuality, had made him a hero to conservative Catholics and a thorn in the side of reformers. Behind the grandeur of the Vatican, beyond the public ceremonies and the carefully curated image of unity, the power struggle between two distinct visions of the Church had reached a boiling point. As the days passed, more and more cardinals were being drawn into the growing divide between the traditionalists, led by Cardinal Burke, and the reformists, represented by Cardinal Tagle. What had once been a quiet undercurrent in the Church now exploded into open contention, threatening to fracture the delicate balance of power that had held the Vatican together for centuries. The stakes of the impending conclave were higher than ever. With Pope Francis's papacy nearing its end, the choice of the next pope was more than a matter of succession. It was a pivotal decision that would define the direction of the Church for decades to come. In the hushed corridors of the Vatican, the cardinals were aware that the Church's future would be determined not by divine intervention alone, but by their hands, by their votes, their alliances, and their careful maneuvering behind closed doors. Cardinal Burke had long been a symbol of the old guard, a staunch defender of tradition and orthodoxy. His unwavering commitment to Catholic doctrine made him a respected figure among the more conservative factions of the Church. His opposition to Pope Francis's reforms, particularly on issues such as divorce, remarriage, and the treatment of LGBTQ+ individuals, had made him a hero to those who felt that the Church was drifting too far from its foundational teachings. Yet, despite his influence, Burke had found himself increasingly sidelined within the Vatican hierarchy. Pope Francis's vision of a more inclusive, merciful Church had been gaining ground, and Burke's traditionalist stance seemed to be losing favor. In contrast, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle was seen as the face of the future. Tagle, a Filipino cardinal who had won admiration for his pastoral approach and his efforts to bring the Church closer to the marginalized, was a vocal supporter of Pope Francis's reforms. He championed the idea of a Church that was open, inclusive, and adaptable to the needs of the modern world. His embrace of social justice, interfaith dialogue, and greater pastoral flexibility had made him a favorite among progressive Catholics. But it had also alienated those who feared that such changes could lead the Church away from its traditional roots. As the conclave approached, the tension between Burke and Tagle reached a fever pitch. The divide was no longer just about theology or doctrine. It was about power. Each faction began to strategize and form alliances, with the outcome of the conclave hanging in the balance. Cardinals who had once been loyal to Pope Francis now found themselves torn between the two sides. Some feared that a pope aligned with Burke's traditionalism would undo much of the progress that had been made under Francis, while others worried that a pope in the mold of Tagle would go too far in altering the Church's core teachings. The conclave was approaching, and the tension between the cardinals could not have been more palpable. Cardinal Burke, the steadfast traditionalist, and Cardinal Tagle, the progressive reformer, had become the central figures in a contest that would determine not just the future leadership of the Catholic Church, but its very identity. With Pope Francis's papacy nearing its end, the choices of the cardinals had never been more critical. Their decision would shape the course of the Church for years, possibly decades to come. The ideological divide that defined the Church under Pope Francis had already been a point of contention during his papacy. His calls for a more inclusive Church His compassionate stance on LGBTQ+ issues and his openness to reform in areas like divorce and remarriage had often put him at odds with the more conservative elements of the church. Cardinal Burke was one of the most vocal critics of these reforms, arguing that the church needed to return to its doctrinal roots, focusing on tradition and orthodoxy. For Burke and his supporters, the faith was not a flexible institution to bend with the times. Rather, it was a timeless and unchanging truth that needed to be upheld in its purest form. In contrast, Cardinal Tagle, with his pastoral sensitivity and his focus on social justice, had championed the need for a church that embraced the modern world. He advocated for a church that welcomed the marginalized, the poor, the immigrants, and the outcasts. His message resonated deeply with those who believed that the church had to engage with the world's challenges rather than retreat into dogma. Tagle's supporters were drawn to his openness, his willingness to challenge the status quo, and his compassionate approach to church doctrine. They viewed him as a breath of fresh air, someone who could guide the church into a new era. The Cardinals' divisions were not just about theology, they were also deeply personal. Many of the voting cardinals had forged allegiances with one another over the years, and these alliances were now coming into play as the conclave approached. The tension between Burke's traditionalism and Tagle's reformism was being mirrored in these alliances, and the coming days would see backroom negotiations, whispered conversations, and strategic votes that would ultimately decide the future of the papacy. The power struggle within the conclave was more than a mere battle of ideas. It was also a battle of personalities. Cardinal Burke had built a reputation as a formidable and unyielding defender of Catholic tradition, and his presence in the conclave would undoubtedly exert a significant influence. His supporters, who included many conservative cardinals, were fiercely loyal to him, believing that his vision was the only path forward for the church. They feared that a pope aligned with Tagle's progressive views would dilute the church's teachings and lead it further away from its true mission. As the conclave began, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The cardinals, now sequestered in the Vatican, were preparing to choose the next pope, a decision that would define the course of the Catholic Church for generations to come. The internal dynamics within the conclave, however, were anything but serene. Behind closed doors, the political maneuvering, personal alliances, and ideological divisions that had been simmering for years now came to the forefront. Cardinal Burke, known for his staunch conservatism, had been a key figure in the Vatican's resistance to the more progressive reforms initiated by Pope Francis. His traditionalist views on marriage, the role of women in the church, and the church's relationship with the secular world had earned him both admiration and criticism. For years, Burke had warned of the dangers of straying too far from church teachings, and he had been unrelenting in his defense of orthodoxy. Now, as the conclave approached, he was determined to ensure that the next pope would share his commitment to preserving the sacred traditions of the church. Despite his vocal opposition to Pope Francis's papacy, Cardinal Burke was well aware of the influence that Pope Francis had cultivated within the Vatican. The progressive reforms that Pope Francis had introduced had left an indelible mark on the church, and there was no turning back. The question now was whether the church would continue down the path of reform or whether it would return to a more traditional approach. The decision would ultimately rest in the hands of the cardinals, and Burke knew that he would need to garner significant support from his fellow conservatives if his vision for the church was to prevail. Meanwhile, Cardinal Tagle, a leading figure among the reformist cardinals, was gaining momentum. His message of mercy, inclusion, and compassion had struck a chord with many cardinals, particularly those who felt that the church needed to modernize in order to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. Tagle's supporters believed that he was the pope who could lead the church into the future, bridging the gap between tradition and progress. For them, the future of the church was about embracing the modern world without losing sight of its spiritual mission. Tagle's rise within the conclave was no accident. Over the years, he had built a reputation as a compassionate and visionary leader, one who was not afraid to tackle difficult issues. His deep spirituality and his commitment to the poor and marginalized had earned him the respect of cardinals from across the globe. He had also forged important alliances within the Vatican, particularly with cardinals from the global south, who were eager to see the church become more inclusive and engage with the issues facing the developing world. As the days of the conclave stretched on, it became clear that the cardinals were facing a difficult decision. The ideological divide between tradition and reform was not just a matter of theological debate. It was a deeply personal issue for many of the cardinals. For some, the choice of pope was a matter of preserving the integrity of the church's teachings. For others, it was about ensuring that the church could respond effectively to the challenges of the modern world. The conclave had entered its final stages, and the tension between the conservative and reformist factions was palpable. The atmosphere in the Sistine Chapel, where the cardinals gathered to vote for the next pope, was charged with anticipation. Outside, the faithful waited anxiously, their hopes and prayers directed toward the conclave's outcome, unaware of the quiet but intense power struggles taking place within the walls of the Vatican. Cardinal Raymond Burke, a stalwart defender of Catholic tradition, continued to push for the election of a pope who would uphold the unchanging doctrines of the Church. His vision of the papacy was one of doctrinal clarity, a return to traditional liturgical practices, and a firm stance against what he saw as the dilution of Catholic teachings. For Burke, the challenges facing the Church were not just matters of theology. They were existential questions about the very identity of the Church itself. He believed that the Church's integrity was at risk, and he was willing to fight to preserve it. At the same time, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, a rising star within the Vatican, was positioning himself as the leader of a more progressive wing of the Church. Tagle had spent much of his career championing the causes of the poor, the marginalized, and those who felt excluded from the Church's embrace. His message of mercy, inclusion, and pastoral care had resonated deeply with many of the faithful, particularly in the global South, where the Church was growing rapidly. For Tagle and his supporters, the Church's future was about adapting to the needs of the modern world, embracing social justice, and fostering a spirit of love and compassion. As the cardinals deliberated, it became clear that there was no easy middle ground between these two factions. The ideological divide was not merely a matter of theological disagreement. It was a clash of visions for the Church's future. Burke and his supporters saw the Church as a timeless institution that must resist the forces of secularism and modernism. Tagle and his allies, on the other hand, viewed the Church as a dynamic, living entity that must respond to the changing needs of the world, particularly in the face of social, political, and economic challenges. The struggle between tradition and reform was not just an intellectual exercise, it had real-world implications for the future of the Church. For many of the cardinals, the outcome of the conclave would determine how the Church would engage with issues such as divorce, same-sex marriage, contraception, and the role of women in the Church. It would also shape the Church's relationship with the wider world, including its engagement with interfaith dialogue, the environment, and global social justice issues. The divisions within the conclave were reflected in the way the cardinals conducted themselves in the days leading up to the election. The more conservative cardinals, led by Burke, were increasingly vocal in their criticism of what they saw as the excessive liberalism of Pope Francis's papacy. They pointed to the changes in church teaching on issues like divorce and remarriage, as well as the growing acceptance of LGBTQ+ rights as signs of a weakening of Catholic doctrine. For these cardinals, the election of a new pope was a chance to correct what they viewed as the errors of the Francis papacy and return the Church to its traditional roots. On the other side, the reformist cardinals, including Tagle, were advocating for a more inclusive, compassionate church that would meet the needs of the modern world. They argued that the Church must find new ways to engage with a rapidly changing society, particularly in the areas of social justice, poverty, and environmental stewardship. They believed that the future of the Church depended on its ability to adapt to new realities while remaining true to its core teachings of love and mercy. As the conclave reached its conclusion, the Catholic Church stood at a profound crossroads. The election of a new pope would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not only in the life of the Vatican, but in the trajectory of global Christianity. The tension between tradition and progress had shaped the course of the conclave, and it was clear that the decisions made in the coming days would have lasting implications for the Church, its faithful, and its role in the world. For Cardinal Burke and his supporters, The hope was that the next pope would uphold the traditional teachings of the church, maintaining doctrinal purity and resisting the forces of secularism and modernism. They saw the church as a timeless institution that had a sacred duty to preserve its teachings and resist the pressures of a rapidly changing world. They believed that a pope who adhered to these values would ensure the integrity of the church for generations to come. On the other hand, Cardinal Tagle and his allies saw the future of the church as one that embraced mercy, inclusivity, and a pastoral approach to the world's most pressing issues. For them, the church could not afford to remain stagnant in the face of growing inequality, environmental destruction, and social injustice. They believed that a pope who understood the challenges of the modern world and was willing to adapt the church's teachings to meet those challenges would ensure its relevance and growth in the 21st century. In the end, the conclave was not just about choosing a new pope. It was about deciding what kind of church the cardinals wanted to lead. Would it be a church that clung to tradition and resisted change, or would it be a church that boldly confronted the issues of our time with compassion and humility? As the smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, signaling the election of a new pope, the faithful around the world held their breath. In that moment, the future of the Catholic Church was in the hands of the cardinals, and their decision would shape the church for years to come. The church's journey forward, regardless of the outcome, would be marked by the same challenges, hopes, and prayers that had guided it for centuries. And as the new pope emerged to address the world, it was clear that the journey was far from over. The question remained: would the church rise to meet the needs of the modern world, or would it retreat into its past?